Today I'm sewing and sharing a vintage pattern. This is McCall's 8379. This past weekend I picked up this pattern at the local fabric store. It's a 1970s wrap dress design with some unique features. It has double French darts extending from the waist seam on the front bodice pieces. It also has double darts at each sleeve cap, and it calls for seam binding for the inside waistline seam for a nice finish. You can find this pattern at your local fabric store and online. I've left a link for you below so you can check out all the details, grab a copy, and sew along with me. Grab that pattern, cut out your fabric, mark your dots and notches, and let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is prepare our front darts. I've gone ahead and used my pattern piece to trace the dart lines onto the wrong side of my fabric. And then I used chalk to outline those traced lines for better visibility. Fold the dart in half right sides together to match those dart legs. Pin through one dart leg and out the other. Do this for both darts, and pin those darts for both front bodice pieces. Then we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew through both layers for all the darts, sewing along the traced lines from the bottom of the garment to the tip of the dart. Backstitch at both ends to secure. So here are what the darts should look like on the outside of the garment once they're sewn. And for the seams on the inside, we're going to trim them down to 3/8 of an inch from the seam line. Because I'm not worried about this jersey material fraying, I'm going to leave these seams as they are, unfinished. And then I'm going to press them down toward the bottom of the garment. And do that for both of your front bodice pieces. At the bottom side seam of our back bodice pattern piece, we have two small dots indicating where we're going to be leaving an opening in our stitching for the tie wrap. I'm going to transfer those dots to the right side of my back bodice, just using pins. Now I'm going to place my front and back bodice pieces right sides together, matching the shoulder seams, and pin in place. Also pin your side seams. Now I'm going to sew my shoulder seams and side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, remembering to leave this portion on the right side seam open for the tie wrap. So for this seam, I'll start at the top and sew all the way down at 5/8 of an inch, and then stop my stitching at the first pin, backstitching to secure, starting a fresh set of stitches at the next pin, again backstitching to secure, and sewing to the bottom of the garment. Press all of those seams open. I've fused knit interfacing to the wrong side of both my front and back neck facing pieces. Now I'm going to place these facing pieces right sides together, matching my shoulder seams, and pin in place. Then I'm going to sew my facing shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now that my shoulder seams are sewn and pressed open, I've also taken the outer edges of the facing to the ironing board and I've pressed them to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, all the way around. Now I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and sew close to that inner raw edge all the way around for a nice finish on the inside. Now we're going to place our facing right sides together with the bodice and pin in place, matching your center fronts and your notches. Now that I have my facing pinned to both of my center fronts and around the neckline, I'm going to sew it in place with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that the facing is sewn to the bodice, we want to grade the facing seam. I'm going to separate the two pieces of the seam allowance and trim both sides at different widths. I'll trim one to a width of 3/8 and the other to a width of 1/4 of an inch. Additionally, I'm going to clip into the curves all around the facing so that the facing turns nicely to the inside of the garment. Just clip close to that stitching line, but not beyond. And now we're ready to understitch the facing. Flip the facing away from the bodice and on top of its seam allowance. And then we're going to sew the facing to the seam allowance about 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line, all the way around. I've transferred the dart lines from my pattern piece to the wrong side of both of the top of my sleeves. And now I'm ready to pin them together. Fold your darts in half and pin through one dart leg and out the other. Do this for both sleeves. Now we can sew along our trace lines for both darts for both sleeve heads. Backstitching at the beginning and the end of our stitches. Here is what those darts will look like on the outside of the sleeve. On the inside, you're going to press these darts away from each other. Now fold both of your sleeves right sides together with themselves, matching the underarm seams and pin in place. Sew both underarm seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. For the bottoms of both of my sleeves, I've gone ahead and pressed those bottom raw edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. The pattern instructions recommend hand sewing an invisible stitch for the bottom of these sleeves, but I'm just going to take it to my sewing machine and finish these edges just as I did for the inside of the facings, just sewing all around the bottom of the sleeve close to that inner raw edge. For preparing the sleeve to be inserted into the arm side, the pattern instructions tell you to sew basting stitches along the seam head so that you can pull the threads to ease the sleeve into the armhole. I would definitely do this if I were sewing a woven material with no stretch. But because this jersey material has a good amount of stretch, I'm going to use that stretch to ease the sleeve into the armhole. I've already sewn one of my sleeves in here. So for the remaining sleeve, I'm going to place it right sides together with the bodice, matching my notches, and pin in place, starting at the underarm seam. Then I'll match the center of the top of my sleeve right between those darts with my shoulder seam and pin in place. And then continue pinning all the way around, easing as needed. Now that I have my sleeve pinned into the armhole all the way around, I'm ready to sew it in place with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Place your two front skirt pieces right sides together and pin your center front seam as marked on your pattern piece. Sew your center front seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seam open. Now we're going to attach our front and back skirt pieces, attaching the back pieces to their corresponding side of the front piece, placing them right sides together and pin in place. Do this to attach both of your back panels to either side of the front piece. Now I'm going to sew both of those back skirts to the front skirt with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then press the seams open. Now we're going to take the outer edges of both of our back skirt pieces right along this facing section and press them to the wrong side of the garment 2 separate times. We're going to press the full facing section to the wrong side to create a memory crease here at 1 7/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to separately take the outermost edge and fold it to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch and press that in place. Now, just as I did for the edges of the facing and for the bottom of the sleeves, I'm going to take this 1/4 inch folded section and sew close to that raw edge all the way from top to bottom of this back facing section. Do this for both back pieces for both sides of the skirt. Now that the outer vertical edge of the back pieces are finished, fold them to the wrong side of the garment along that memory crease. Pin the tops in place. Do this for both back pieces. Now we can take these top edges of both of the back pieces and baste these sections in place with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to start attaching the bottom of the bodice to the top of the skirt. Here is the right side of my bodice, right side up. I'm going to place the right side of my back skirt right sides together with the bottom of the bodice. I'm going to take that folded back section that we basted earlier and match up the outer edge of that fold with the center back of my bodice and pin in place. Then I'm going to match up my seams and notches and continue pinning this skirt until I reach the bottom end of my right bodice piece. Note that the bottom edge of your bodice will extend 5/8 of an inch beyond that left side seam. Now we're going to sew this section of the skirt and bodice together. We're going to start stitching at that center back of the bodice, back stitching to secure, and continuing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, stopping at the left side seam of the skirt, back stitching to secure. I've gone ahead and cut my seam binding using my seam binding pattern piece. Now I'm going to start applying it to the skirt, starting at the seam closest to the edge of the left skirt piece. I've transferred the dots from the seam binding pattern piece to the binding using pins. I'm going to place one of the short edges of my binding at that left skirt side seam, pinning it in place 1/8 of an inch below the top edge of the skirt. I'm going to continue pinning that binding, matching the pins on my binding to the seams of the skirt, and continuing to pin that binding in place 1/8 of an inch below the top of the skirt. We're going to pin the opposite short edge of the binding to that bottom edge of the left front bodice piece. Now that I have that stay tape pinned in place, I'm going to sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, just catching that bottom edge of the seam binding as I go. Now my seam binding is sewn through all thicknesses of the skirt and the bodice, and I'm going to trim the seam allowance of the bodice and skirt pieces to 3/8 of an inch as far as the seam binding. Now along this loose left bottom edge of the bodice, I'm going to turn that stay tape up toward the bodice, turning it up right along that lower edge of the stay tape. I'm going to pin that in place from this center back to the bottom edge of the left bodice. Then we're going to stitch from the center back to the bottom of the left bodice with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. This will keep the stay tape from turning and being visible from the right side of the garment. On your waistband and tie piece, you have small dots indicating where we're going to be stopping our stitching. I've transferred that stitching indicator to my fabric with a pin. Now I'm going to fold my waistband and tie piece right sides together lengthwise and pin it together from the angled edge to my pin. Also pin that angled edge, then we're going to take it to our sewing machine and sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from the top of that angle down to the bottom and pivoting our stitching, stitching all the way to the pin, back stitching to secure. Now I'm going to take my scissors and clip to that small dot right where my stitching ended, making sure to clip to the stitching line but not through. Then I'm going to trim these seam allowances to reduce bulk. Now to prepare to attach this waistband to the bodice, I'm going to mark the center fold line of this waistband at the straight edge, just using a pin. Here is the bottom facing edge of my right bodice. Place that pinned straight edge of your waistband and tie piece right sides together with this straight facing edge of the right bodice. Placing that center point pin of your waistband right at the facing seam at the bottom of your bodice. So your facing here is opened out. And pin in place. Continue pinning that straight edge of the waistband and tie piece to that bottom edge of the bodice. So now that that's pinned, note that both ends of the waistband and tie piece will extend 5/8 of an inch beyond the edge of the bodice. So the bottom edge of this waistband and tie piece will extend 5/8 of an inch beyond that waistline seam, and the top edge of this tie piece will extend 5/8 of an inch beyond the outer edge of that bodice. Sew this tie piece to the edge of the bodice with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and back stitching to secure. Now that that waistband and tie piece is connected to the bottom edge of the right bodice, we're going to attach the notched layer of the waistband and tie piece to the top of the left skirt. Fold your bodice down so that it's facing right sides together with the skirt piece, and so that the top of this tie piece is now right sides together with the left skirt. Pin the tie in place from the seam to the edge of the left skirt, matching your notches. And the notch that we clipped into the tie piece earlier will match up with that edge of the left skirt and pin in place. Now we're going to sew the tie piece to the top of that skirt from the seam, backstitching to secure with a 5/8 inch seam allowance to the notch in the tie piece and the end of the skirt, again backstitching to secure. Remember to keep the opposite unnotched edge of your tie piece out of the way as you sew. Now that that's sewn, I'm going to trim that tie piece and skirt seam allowance by about half. Then I'm going to turn the sewn section of my tie right side out. And then give that turned out tie piece a good press. Before I complete the tie piece on the inside of the garment, I want to finish this seam binding on the inside so that it's secured and lays nice and flat. I'm going to fold that seam binding up toward the bodice, and from one edge of the seam binding all the way to the other edge, I'm going to edge stitch the seam binding, sewing the seam binding to the bodice from end to end. Now we can finish that inner edge of that waistband and tie piece. For this loose inner edge, fold that raw edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch and place that folded edge right over the seam of the waistline. Pin in place from the seam to the edge of the skirt. At this point, you could choose to use a needle and thread to slip stitch the tie piece to the top of the skirt. Alternatively, you could take this to your sewing machine and from the front of the skirt, stitch in the ditch of that original waistline seam, catching that inner folded edge as you sew. Now here is the bottom edge of my left bodice opened out flat, and the edge of my facing is also opened out flat. Take the straight edge of your remaining tie piece and place it right sides together with that facing edge of your left bodice. We're going to pin that in place so that once again the tie piece extends 5/8 of an inch over the bodice on both sides. And then take it to your machine and sew that tie in place along that straight short edge. Fold that tie piece right sides together. Pin it in place all along that straight long edge, as well as the angled short edge. And then sew your tie piece along that long edge and angled short edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And then trim those seam allowances and turn this tie piece right side out. And then give your tie a good press. And then slip stitch or stitch in the ditch to secure this open edge where the tie meets the bodice. Now it's time to sew on the snap closure according to the snap placement markings on your back bodice piece and your waistband and tie piece. I'm going to sew one part of my snap right here at the left side seam, marked here with chalk where I want it to go. And for the other half of the snap, it's going to be sewn on the inside of the garment where the waistband and tie piece meets the bodice, and again I've marked that placement in chalk. The hem allowance for the bottom of the dress is 2 5/8 of an inch, but you can try your dress on and determine how wide or how narrow you want your hem to be. I'm just going to fold the bottom edge of my dress to the wrong side by about 1/2 of an inch all the way around, and then I'm going to edge stitch close to that inner raw edge all the way around the bottom of the dress. At each of the edges of your back skirt, you're going to be opening out that facing and including that facing portion in your hem. Now that I have my hem finished all the way across, I'm going to fold that facing back along its memory crease and clip that bottom edge in place. Do this on both sides of the skirt. Now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew right along that original hem stitching line from one folded edge of the facing to the other. Do this on both sides. Now our vintage wrap dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.